In 1975, the Hollywood industry was experiencing a strange paradox. While Spielberg's Jaws was redefining blockbuster success and changing the industry forever, dozens of ambitious projects were sinking faster than ships in shark-infested waters. Studios were hemorrhaging money on star-studded productions that audiences simply refused to see. From musical disasters to political thrillers that missed their mark, 1975 saw career-defining failures for some of the industry's biggest names. Even legends like Clint Eastwood and newcomers like Jeff Bridges weren't immune to the box office curse that seemed to plague that fateful year. Let's dive straight into it and talk about the 13 biggest box office disasters from 1975 that made Hollywood executives cry into their cornflakes. The Wilby Conspiracy stands as perhaps the most obscure political thriller of the 1970s, despite boasting two major stars in Michael Caine and Sidney Poitier. Set in apartheid-era South Africa, this film should have been a powerful statement on racism. Instead, it became a forgotten footnote in both stars' careers. Caine and Poitier play unlikely allies, an English engineer and a black activist, who go on the run from South African authorities. What could have been a gripping thriller with meaningful social commentary instead became a middling chase movie that never fully committed to either its political message or action elements. The film suffered from a confused tone, with reviewers noting that the serious topic of apartheid seemed at odds with the more light-hearted adventure elements. Though filmed in Kenya rather than South Africa, the production still faced numerous challenges. Director Ralph Nelson had previously worked with Poitier on the Oscar-winning Lilies of the Field, but lightning didn't strike twice. The Wilby Conspiracy opened to minimal fanfare and quickly disappeared from theaters, with audiences staying away in droves. Despite the continued relevance of its anti-apartheid message, the film has never developed any significant following. The Wilby Conspiracy never found its audience, remaining a curious blip in the distinguished careers of its two leading men. Hearts of the West represents one of those painful Hollywood ironies, a film beloved by critics that audiences simply refused to see. Starring Jeff Bridges as Louis Tater, an aspiring Western novelist who ends up working as an extra in 1930s Hollywood B-Westerns, the film was charming, nostalgic, and completely ignored at the box office. Directed by Howard Zieff, this Western comedy had everything going for it on paper. A stellar cast including Bridges, Andy Griffith, Alan Arkin, and Blythe Danner, plus a screenplay that paid tribute to Hollywood's golden age of Westerns. Roger Ebert called it a lovely little comedy, a movie to feel fond of. Yet, when released by MGM in October 1975, Hearts of the West played to empty theaters. One reviewer who saw it during its initial run recalled that it didn't rate a week's screen time before being pulled. The film's gentle humor couldn't compete with more sensational fare. Part of the problem was marketing. MGM seemed unsure how to position a film that wasn't quite a Western, wasn't quite a comedy, and wasn't quite a drama. Without a clear hook, the film drifted into obscurity despite its considerable charms. The film developed a minor cult following years later through campus screenings, but its initial failure stands as a prime example of critical acclaim failing to translate into commercial success. If ever there was a film concept doomed to failure, it might be a comedy sequel to one of the greatest film noir classics of all time. The Blackbird attempted exactly that, with George Segal starring as Sam Spade Jr., the son of Humphrey Bogart's iconic detective from The Maltese Falcon. Released in December 1975, this ill-conceived project bombed with both critics and audiences. The film's premise had Sam Jr. inheriting his father's detective agency and becoming involved in another chase for the legendary Maltese Falcon. Lee Patrick and Alicia Cook Jr. from the original 1941 film reprised their roles as Effie Perrine and Wilmer Cook. Behind the scenes, The Blackbird was plagued with problems. Writer David Gieler was given the opportunity to direct, making this his first and last directorial effort. The script, originally intended as a serious sequel, was hastily reworked as a comedy when the studio lost faith. The result was a tonal mess that film critic Pauline Kael described as a dumb comedy with an insecure tone and some good ideas mixed with some terrible ones. Audiences who revered the original Maltese Falcon were appalled by the attempt to turn it into a slapstick comedy. The Blackbird quickly vanished from theaters and became a cautionary tale about tampering with cinema classics. It remains rarely screened and never released on DVD, cementing its status as one of Hollywood's most misguided sequels. Horror films were big business in the mid-1970s following the success of The Exorcist, but The Devil's Reign proved that not every demonic tale could conjure box office magic. This bizarre horror film featuring Ernest Borgnine, William Shatner, and Church of Satan founder Anton LaVey melted away at the box office faster than its characters dissolved on screen. The plot centered around a satanic cult leader, Borgnine, seeking an ancient book that could grant him immense powers. The film's most memorable feature was its extended climax where cult members literally melt into puddles of goo, an effect that consumed a significant portion of the budget. Despite the star power of Shatner, fresh from Star Trek fame, and future stars like John Travolta in a minor role, The Devil's Reign was savaged by critics. Variety called it a well-executed gore-fest which plays like the result of a round-robin story conference. The film's producers had hoped to capitalize on the occult horror trend, but audiences largely stayed away. The marketing campaign, which promised absolutely the most incredible ending of any motion picture ever, couldn't deliver on such hyperbole. Ironically, while The Devil's Reign was a commercial failure in 1975, it has since developed a dedicated cult following among horror enthusiasts who appreciate its practical effects. This afterlife came too late to save it from being one of the year's most notable box office disasters. The Day of the Locust stands as perhaps the most ambitious failure of 1975, a high-budget adaptation of Nathaniel West's acclaimed novel about the dark underbelly of 1930s Hollywood that failed to connect with audiences despite its literary pedigree and star-studded cast. Directed by John Schlesinger fresh off his Oscar win for Midnight Cowboy, the film featured an impressive ensemble including Donald Sutherland, Karen Black, Burgess Meredith, and William Atherton. Paramount Pictures spared no expense, recreating Depression-era Hollywood with meticulous detail. Critics were divided on the film. Some praised its unflinching portrayal of Hollywood's darker side and the exceptional performances, particularly Burgess Meredith's Oscar-nominated turn. Others found it excessive and unpleasant, struggling with the intentionally unlikable characters. But the bigger problem was that audiences simply didn't show up. The Day of the Locust was too bleak, too cynical, and too violent for mainstream moviegoers in 1975. Its scathing critique of the Hollywood dream machine may have been too insider for general audiences. The film's infamous climactic riot scene was particularly polarizing. Paramount had invested heavily in what they hoped would be a prestigious awards contender, but The Day of the Locust failed to recoup its substantial budget. It remains respected in certain critical circles, but is rarely screened outside of film academia. Westerns were falling out of favor with audiences by the mid-1970s, but Columbia Pictures bet big on Bite the Bullet, an ambitious $4 million production starring Gene Hackman, James Coburn, and Candice Bergen. Director Richard Brooks, who had previously struck gold with The Professionals, returned to the genre with this story about a 700-mile endurance horse race across the American Southwest. On paper, the project seemed promising, a character-driven Western with an all-star cast and spectacular location shooting in New Mexico. Brooks spoke passionately about the film, calling it "my love poem to America," but when released in June 1975, Bite the Bullet failed to generate much interest, earning only $5 million in theatrical rentals. Part of the problem was timing. The film opened around the same time as Jaws, which dominated the box office. But beyond that, Bite the Bullet suffered from being neither traditional enough to satisfy Western purists, nor revisionist enough to attract viewers looking for something new. Critics gave mixed reviews, with some praising the beautiful cinematography, while others criticized the episodic structure. Vincent Canby of the New York Times was particularly harsh, writing that the film doesn't contain one moment that might be called genuine. Though nominated for 2 Academy Awards, Bite the Bullet quickly faded from theaters. Despite its impressive cast and stunning visuals, the film remains rarely discussed today. In the superhero-saturated cinema landscape of today, it's easy to forget that Hollywood has a long history of failed attempts to launch franchises based on pulp heroes. 1975's Doc Savage, The Man of Bronze, stands as a prime example, a costly misfire that aimed to establish a series but instead ended a legendary producer's career. Based on the popular pulp magazine character from the 1930s and 40s, Doc Savage starred Ron Ely, best known as TV's Tarzan, as the bronzed, genius adventurer with almost superhuman abilities. The film was produced by George Pal, the visionary behind sci-fi classics like The War of the Worlds. Pal had grand ambitions, hoping to launch a series of Doc Savage films. This first installment even ended with a title card promising a sequel called Doc Savage, The Arch Enemy of Evil. a sequel that would never materialize. The film's biggest problem was its confused tone. Released in June 1975, Doc Savage attempted to capture the campy humor of the 1960s Batman TV series while still functioning as a straightforward adventure. The result satisfied neither approach, with forced humor undermining the action. Then came The Shark. Jaws was released the same month and completely devoured the competition. Doc Savage was quickly buried at the box office, described as hampered by budget woes, weak acting, and painfully forced attempts at camp. For George Pal, it was a heartbreaking end to an illustrious career. Doc Savage would be his final produced film before his death in 1980. Few films epitomize the excess and hubris of 1970s Hollywood quite like Lucky Lady, a production so troubled and costly that it became legendary in the industry for all the wrong reasons. With a star-studded cast of Liza Minnelli, Gene Hackman, and Burt Reynolds, this Prohibition-era comedy about rum runners should have been a hit. Instead, it became one of the year's most expensive disasters. Directed by Stanley Donen, of Singin' in the Rain fame, Lucky Lady's problems began during filming in Mexico. The production was plagued by terrible weather and the logistical nightmare of shooting extensively on water. "I will never make another film on water," Donen later said. "I can't tell you how painful it is." The budget ballooned from an already substantial plan to a reported $13 million. Some estimates put it as high as $22 million, an astronomical sum for 1975. The troubled shoot lasted from February to July, with the cast stuck in a remote location with no TV, no radio, no American papers. When finally released at Christmas 1975, Lucky Lady was met with scathing reviews. Critics called it strident, forced hokum, and a big, expensive, good-looking flop of a movie. Audiences largely stayed away, making the film fail dramatically at the box office. Perhaps the most telling of the film's problems was its ending. Unhappy with the original conclusion, the studio flew the stars to Rome to shoot a new ending. When that version also tested poorly, a third ending was created. When a director publicly apologizes for a film in newspapers across America, you know something has gone terribly wrong. That's exactly what happened with Peter Bogdanovich's musical disaster At Long Last Love, a film so poorly received that it damaged the previously sterling reputation of one of Hollywood's brightest directorial talents. Released in March 1975, this tribute to 1930s movie musicals starred Burt Reynolds and Sybil Shepherd attempting to sing and dance to Cole Porter standards. The operative word is attempting. Neither actor had the musical chops for such demanding material, evident to audiences and critics alike. Bogdanovich approached the film with supreme confidence, deciding that all musical numbers would be recorded live during filming rather than pre-recorded. This technique proved disastrous with inexperienced singing performers. Critics were merciless. John Simon called it the worst musical of this or any other decade, while Pauline Kael described it as stillborn. The film cost $6 million to produce, but earned only about $1.5 million at the box office, making it a financial catastrophe for 20th Century Fox. The studio rushed the film into release with minimal preview screenings. When audiences failed to respond, Fox hastily re-edited the movie, but the damage was done. Bogdanovich had an open letter of apology printed in newspapers across the country. The failure marked a turning point in Bogdanovich's career from which he would never fully recover. Even Clint Eastwood wasn't immune to the box office curse of 1975. The Eiger Sanction, his mountain-climbing thriller based on the best-selling novel by Trevanian, was plagued by production problems and failed to scale the heights of commercial success despite Eastwood's considerable star power. Eastwood both directed and starred as Dr. Jonathan Hemlock, a retired assassin and mountain climber who's blackmailed into performing one last sanction during a treacherous climb of the Eiger Mountain in Switzerland. The film attempted to blend the spy thriller genre with alpine action sequences. The production was marred by tragedy when a 26-year-old British climber hired as a cameraman was killed during filming in the Alps. Eastwood, who insisted on performing many of his own dangerous climbing stunts despite being in his mid-40s, said, "We were very safety conscious after that." When released in May 1975, The Eiger Sanction received mixed reviews, with critics finding the plot convoluted and the pacing uneven. The climbing sequences were praised, but the spy story elements were considered derivative of James Bond films. Box office returns were disappointing given Eastwood's usual drawing power. The film didn't lose money, but it underperformed significantly compared to expectations. Coming after the success of Dirty Harry, The Eiger Sanction suggested that audiences preferred Eastwood in more straightforward action roles. Rollerball represents one of Hollywood's most intriguing paradoxes. A film considered a commercial disappointment upon its initial release that later developed a significant cult following and is now regarded by many as a prescient science fiction classic. Directed by Norman Jewison and starring James Caan, this dystopian sports film depicted a violent futuristic game designed to suppress individualism and demonstrate the futility of personal effort. Released in June 1975, Rollerball was an expensive production with elaborate game sequences. Critics were divided on the film. Some praised its visual style and social commentary, while others found it excessively violent and heavy-handed. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars but noted that it works best as a bizarre sports movie rather than as a piece of science fiction. At the box office, Rollerball performed below expectations given its substantial budget. The R rating limited its audience, and the dark, pessimistic tone didn't resonate with summer moviegoers during the Jaws phenomenon. The irony is that Rollerball's reputation has grown substantially over the decades. Its vision of a corporate-controlled future where violent sports distract the masses now seems eerily prophetic. The film's production design and game sequences have aged well, influencing later films and even real-world extreme sports. This critical reassessment came too late to help the film's initial commercial prospects. How do you follow up one of the most successful musical biopics of all time? Very carefully. A lesson learned the hard way by the makers of Funny Lady, the 1975 sequel to the Oscar-winning Funny Girl that failed to recapture the magic of its predecessor despite bringing back Barbra Streisand as Fanny Brice. With a hefty budget of $7 million, Funny Lady picked up Fanny's story during the Great Depression as she meets and marries impresario Billy Rose, played by James Caan. Omar Sharif returned briefly as Nick Arnstein, but the chemistry that made the original film so compelling was missing from this follow-up. Critics generally found the sequel inferior to the original in almost every way. The songs were less memorable, the story less engaging, and even Streisand's performance lacked some of the freshness of her first outing. Box office results were mixed. The film earned around $40 million domestically, making it the 7th highest grossing picture of 1975. On paper, this doesn't sound like a failure, but given the enormous success of Funny Girl, the budget, and the expectations for a Streisand musical, Funny Lady was considered a significant commercial disappointment. The production received 5 Academy Award nominations, but won none, another indication of how it failed to match the acclaim of its predecessor, which had won Streisand the Best Actress Oscar. Funny Lady's relative failure marked the beginning of the end for big-budget musical biographies in Hollywood. Perhaps the most fascinating failure of 1975 was a bizarre musical that initially bombed so spectacularly that 20th Century Fox pulled it from theaters, only to become the longest-running theatrical release in cinema history and one of the most profitable cult films ever made. The Rocky Horror Picture Show stands as proof that initial box office results don't always determine a film's legacy. Directed by Jim Sharman and starring Tim Curry as the sexually ambiguous alien Dr. Frank N. Furter, this campy horror musical opened in August 1975 to disastrous reviews and empty theaters. Critics were baffled by its strange blend of science fiction, horror tropes, and risque musical numbers. Audiences were equally confused, and attendance was so poor that Fox quickly pulled the film from its planned wide release. It seemed destined to be forgotten, until a strange phenomenon began at the Waverly Theater in New York City in April 1976, where it began playing as a midnight movie. Audiences started returning weekly, developing ritualized responses to the dialogue, dressing as characters, and bringing props. What had been a box office disaster gradually transformed into a cultural phenomenon through these participatory screenings. By the end of the 1970s, the Rocky Horror Picture Show was playing midnight showings in hundreds of theaters across America. A film that had initially lost money for Fox had grossed over $100 million from theatrical showings alone. The ultimate irony is that its initial commercial failure was perhaps necessary for its eventual success. Had it been a mainstream hit, it might never have developed the cult following that transformed it into a cultural institution.